Heavy clashes take place in Aleppo, and the regime forces invade several neighborhoods in Damascus, prosecuting civilians. More than 80 killed by the regime forces today, and the bombardment continues on Homs and its suburbs. Also in the news, the foreign ministry of the regime refuses the invitation of the Arab Ministerial Committee to find a safe way out for al-Assad in exchange for leaving presidency. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. More than 80 victims were killed by the regime forces today, according to the Syrian Human Rights Network, 6 of whom were in Aleppo and its suburbs, amid heavy clashes between the Syrian regime and the Syrian Freedom Army that announced its complete control over the neighborhoods of the city. Meanwhile, activists posted images that showed the destruction of 2 of the regime tanks and taking control of the 3rd one after its team left the tank and ran away. And these are images from Aleppo showing the clashes between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces.
فخر رصاص عم ننزل الله أكبر 23 7 12 حلب صلاح الدين اطلاق الرصاص على المنازل من حاجز الملعب.
And the Syrian Freedom Army in Aleppo has declared that it has taken full control over the neighborhoods of Sheikh Najjar, Tariq al-Bab and Sakhur after violent clashes with the Syrian regime, which in turn are pounding the liberated areas using helicopters and tanks, causing destruction in many residential areas and displacement of many civilians. More in the following report.
Battles are raging in Aleppo, where the Syrian Freedom Army has announced that it has full control over large areas such as Al-Sakhur, Saif al-Dawla and Al-Sheikh Najjar, and that it was able to penetrate several security zones near the radio station building, where clashes took place, and close to the military infantry school, causing losses in the ranks of the regime army. The battles led by the Freedom Army in Aleppo inspired many regime officers to defect. In fact, the defections were not limited to the military, but also included members of the judiciary system in Aleppo. The street wars that are being waged by the rebels with their modest weapons caused a breach in the regime configurations, which in turn handed over many of the security barriers with little resistance, leaving behind weapons and ammunition, making most of the eastern and northern areas under the control of the Freedom Army. Forces of the Syrian regime, and as usual, after losing control on any of the areas, retaliate with bombing buildings and neighborhoods, as it is the case in the neighborhoods of Masakin Hanano, Salah ad-Din and Al-Sakhur, paving the way for the tanks and heavy ammunition which has entered the neighborhood of Al-Haydariya and indiscriminately bombed many buildings, causing considerable damage.
حركة نزوح للأهالي من حي الصاخور بعد أن دخلت الطائرات والدبابات لتقصف المدنيين العزل.
The displacement of citizens was observed in the morning in the neighborhoods of Hanano, Al-Sakhur and Al-Haydariya, while military formations were seen near the infantry college, and activists said that the missile battalion might target Aleppo's eastern neighborhoods, which will face the same doomed fate of Homs, Deir ez-Zor and Damascus.
Massive explosions rocked the towns of Ain Tarma and Al-Hama in Damascus suburbs due to the continuous heavy bombardment. The military campaign that was carried out on the capital, Damascus, reached several residential neighborhoods amid massive displacement of citizens and the shortage of food, medical supplies, and a complete disconnection of electricity. In Damascus suburbs as well, the citizens found 13 unknown bodies in Ma'damiyat al-Sham. Meanwhile, bombardment continued for the fourth consecutive day on the town of Diabiya using rocket missiles and mortar shells, which caused many casualties. Meanwhile, activists reported that military reinforcements reached the military barriers amid disconnection of electricity. Furthermore, heavy clashes occurred between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces.
Bolaco tried to burn it down, and then came the French and tried to destroy it. Another regime tries to wipe it off the map, but the revolution seems to be increasing in Damascus to write its own future history about the tales of the revolution. Military reinforcement and armies of tanks, soldiers and the regime's artillery invaded the neighborhoods of Al-Fayha, Nahar Aisha, Al-Tadamun, Al-Shughur and Al-Asali, as the regime surrounds and bombs the cities with its military planes. The regime's military planes also bombed the neighborhood of Al-Qadam, where heavy clashes occurred on the Daraa-Damascus International Road, which caused the breakout of a big fire and plumes of smoke that rose up in the neighborhoods of Al-Qadam and Al-Hajar al-Aswad. The situation did not differ in the neighborhoods of Al-Qabun and Mizze that were invaded and demolished by the regime forces. In Berzeh, the regime carried out prosecution campaigns where groups of civilians were killed after the government forces invaded their houses and robbed its contents. Massacres and public prosecutions are being carried out in Damascus suburbs, where several civilians were publicly prosecuted in Al-Damir. The regime's heavy artillery bombardment also reached Sayyida Zainab, Hajar al-Balad, Ma'damiyat al-Sham, Zabadani, Qudsaya, Al-Hama, Harasta, Yabrud and Qatana, at the time where explosion sounds were heard in the area of Al-Baraka, and heavy gunfire was also heard in Zamalka, Masraba and Artuz. And finally, heavy clashes occurred between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces in the city of Daraya, that is still being bombed by the mortar shells of the regime that is launching its attacks from Al-Mizzi military airport, and reports stated the fall of many casualties.
Moving on to Homs, where the artillery bombardment also continued on the city of Talbise and its surroundings, where activists stated that one citizen was killed and dozens were injured in El Ghanto due to the heavy bombardment. This bombardment came amid heavy clashes between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces in the city of Al-Rastan. Meanwhile, bombing continued this morning on the old neighborhoods of Homs, which was also in the case in Talbise, Al-Rastan and many other areas.
استهداف الحي بقذائف الهاون والمدفعية والدبابات.
Homs is still suffering under relentless pressure of indiscriminate shelling by the Assad regime forces, which is making the only scene that civilians remember of their homes is complete demolition. The city of Al-Rastan woke up this morning to the usual deadly rainfall of mortar shells and rocket launchers, which with no doubt killed more victims and left hundreds of wounded civilians, most of which were children, with many in severely critical medical conditions. This happened at a time when violent clashes were still taking place between the Assad regime army and the Syrian Freedom Army in the southern part of the city, right after more of the regime's militiamen had tried to break into the area. Meanwhile, the military operations continue to scramble the city of Al-Rastan, where the siege on Jurat al-Shayyah by the Assad regime forces continues.
Allahu Akbar! Allahu Akbar!
In addition, the disrespect of houses of worship is not new and continues to be the cause of destructed mosques. The Khalid bin Walid Mosque in Homs was stained in black on its minaret due to the shelling targeting the mosque. And the brutality seen in Syria by the Assad regime against its own people sees no end, where all rights are being violated and all sorts of crimes are being committed, with Syrian blood continuously being spilled.
And to know more about the situation in Homs, we speak to Sami Rifai from Homs Media Center. Sami, good evening.
Good evening, Yara.
Thank you for being with us. Sami, can you tell us the latest on your side?
Well, I honestly don't know where to start. Shelling on the province of Homs hasn't stopped yet, and the city has been under siege now for over 45 days. There's just no place for people to go. Those who went to Damascus are now trying to return to Homs, but they can't because of the long-imposed siege. Homs is now ruined. It has literally become a city of ghosts. Life is so tough here. People are moving from one place to another as shelling targets new areas. Those who found places to stay are living in extremely desperate conditions. One eyewitness told me yesterday that sometimes 40 people have to stay in just 2 small, humble rooms. And the regime is now testing new weapons on us. We hear different sounds every day. And there's simply no telling how long this is going to take. And there are now growing concerns that the Assad forces are going to use chemical weapons as a last resort. Now, up to this moment, 7 civilians have been martyred. 2 of them were female. Hezbollah militias have also tried to storm Burhani and Sa'arji, which are 2 villages on the Syrian-Lebanese borders. Now, many martyrs have fallen, but the Free Syrian Army has thwarted their assault and now is watching over the city's boundaries. Now, due to Shayah, the city has suffered the worst destruction in Homs, with parts of the city completely flattened on the ground. In some areas, there are about 10 missiles fall all at the same time. In Termali, which is full of refugees, it was also shelled from Assad forces stationed in Al-Mukhtariyah. There was a state of panic there. People don't know where to go. They don't know where to protect their children. Yes, Yara.
Sami, you mentioned... Sami, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You mentioned something about the Hezbollah militias. What makes you sure that they are Hezbollah militias?
Because they come from Lebanon. And we know, the Free Syrian Army know how to distinguish between the Assad forces and Hezbollah forces. And we have also hacked into their network, and we know what they're saying on their, this mobile network. So we know what they're speaking, I know their moves. Citizens told us that these people are not from Syria. They know the accent from the accent. There is a very distinct Lebanese accent. And there are many, many things that, Free Syrian Army know, and we don't know. So they can't really tell us everything, but they confirmed that it was Hezbollah forces, Hezbollah militias. Yes, yeah.
Sami, we're receiving reports that the Syrian Freedom Army is taking control over many parts, especially the border crossings. What about Homs? Is there any sort of activities, similar activities there?
Yes, we have received reports that, the Free Syrian Army is now in control of a large part of Homs, especially the old districts of Homs, Jurt al-Shayah, other parts, but, they're being shelled. They are like in very, bad condition. Sometimes they run out of ammunition and they have to strategically move to another place. So yes, sometimes they control some parts of Homs, but that doesn't last for long. Because, as I said, when there is a siege, you can't really, move freely. Yes, and I should also mention that we have received reports from the central prison of Homs that 3 prisoners were killed, and that there are some cases of suffocation among prisoners, as there was a rebellion inside the prison. However, the forces from the Air Intelligence Agency, as well as the Assad thugs, are now surrounding the prison, and they're now threatening to commit a massacre unless prisoners give in.
Sami, thank you so much, Sami, for your input. That was Sami Rifa'i from Homs Media Center updating us about the latest developments in the city. Coming up later in the bulletin. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. In Idlib, the town of Ma'arat al-Nu'man has been subjected to violent bombing by the regime troops, killing and wounding several civilians. Other towns in Idlib were also attacked heavily today by the regime's shells and rockets, where many homes were set ablaze amid a complete blackout all over the province and its towns and villages.
المنظمة الدولية أن القذائف العنقودية محرمة. انظر إنهم نساء حرائر. ماذا فعلوا لك أيها المجرم السفاح؟ انظر إلى الشباب، انظر إلى هؤلاء، انظر للحظة.
In Daraa, the bombardment was renewed, which targeted several areas and towns, including Khirbat Ghazale, where the regime carried out several military campaigns. More about Daraa we see in this report.
More than 50 rocket missiles, according to activists, fell in one night on the town of Khirbat Ghazale in Daraa suburbs, where dozens of houses were left destroyed and a big number of casualties fell, including ones who are in a critical condition. This comes amid a disconnection of electricity, water, bread, and a massive displacement of citizens who are scared of the regime's violations. The children of Khirbat Ghazale are a solid witness to all what happens in their small village.
احنا كنا بالقبو قاعد نشوف مقصفه اجينا عداله لقيناها اليوم الصبح مطبشه.
The heavy bombardment also reached the town of Hayt, Da'al, Al-Karak, Al-Hirak, and Al-Ghariya, at a time where the regime carried out arrest and robbing campaigns on the towns of Jibab, Inkhil, and Sheikh al-Miskin, as well as arresting tens of innocent civilians. The city of Al-Hara, and for the fifth consecutive day, is still under besiegement after the regime shut down its entrances and exits and banned the citizens from leaving. Even the ones who were displaced from Damascus were not able to enter the city after the regime blocked many roads and shot whoever comes close from the barriers surrounding the city. And despite the bombardment and the besiegement, the citizens of Houran took to the streets in massive protests in Da'al, Jiza, and Tafas, where they chanted for freedom and demanded the overthrow of al-Assad's regime.
Artillery bombardment continued on the mosque in neighborhood of Jbele and Deir ez-Zor, which comes along bombardment on the neighborhood of Al-Amal and the hovering of military helicopters over the city. Meanwhile, artillery bombardment continued on the neighborhoods of Al-Hamidiyya and Jbele, where activists reported the fall of a mortar shell every 5 minutes. Furthermore, the neighborhood of Al-Jura witnessed heavy clashes between the Syrian Freedom Army and the regime forces.
حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل سقوط قذيفة على أحد منازل المدينة حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل الله أكبر عليك يا بشار.
A victim was killed and several were injured due to the shelling on Al-Qunaitara. This shelling destroyed many homes and reached the surrounding farms. Activists said that the shelling was launched by tanks stationed in Khan Arnaba. The military campaign on Hama goes on, where the many districts witnessed a campaign of siege and raids, while shooting was heard from the civil defense checkpoint in Aleppo Road. In the suburbs, shelling targeted Taibat al-Imam and Al-Atamina, as well as Sahl al-Ghab, in which Al-Hawash village was shelled by warplanes for 6 days. According to the EPA of the revolution, the Syrian Freedom Army that is stationed in the city of Atabaka secured the defection of 4 officers who are Brigadier General Adib Ahmed Shalaf, Area Manager Class and City Police Chief, Major Ali Sheikh Ali, Deputy Director and Director of the region, First Lieutenant Adnan Al-Khalaf, Officer of Criminal Security, First Lieutenant Hussein Khalifa, Head of Traffic in the city of Al-Tabaka. Coming up in the bulletin, the masses of Syrian refugees continue to be displaced out of their homes to neighboring countries. European Union decided to tighten its sanctions on Damascus regarding the arms embargo imposed on it in an effort to increase pressure on the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The foreign ministers agreed at the beginning of the European Union meeting in Brussels to add 26 people and 3 new entities to the blacklist of the European Union and tighten the arms embargo through the strengthening of surveillance operations. For her part, the Secretary of State for the European Union, Catherine Ashton, said, "What is happening in Syria is terrible, and EU has to continue with enforcing the sanctions, which are an important part of the pressure on Damascus."
They can have the kind of future that we believe is right for Syria, and that's a future of democracy and freedom. We want to appeal again to
The masses of Syrian refugees continue to be displaced out of their homes to neighboring countries, fleeing away from the brutality of the Assad regime. Both Turkey and Lebanon have tried their best to aid these refugees. However, the situation is only worsening. More about this in the following report.
After many were displaced out of the heart of the capital, Damascus, to other abandoned areas filled with the regime militiamen artillery, these thousands of Syrian families had to continue on to mass displacements along the Turkish and Lebanese borders. According to them, it was the barbaric bombardments of the Assad regime forces that forced them out of their own homes. The Syrian refugees who have left all their belongings in their home country to escape the violence and the daily barrage of shelling by the regime are heading to the more secure border areas in fear of the oppression that they face in their hometowns by the Assad regime. Their medical situations as well as the low levels of food they have is so severely dreadful that the Turkish army had to use tear gas in one of the refugee camps along the Turkish border to disperse a group of furious refugees simply due to the lack of food and water that they live through every day. And these helpless masses of people have now reached 43,000 in just the southwestern camps along the Turkish border. According to what it seems, the Syrian crisis will not be ending soon, and the suffering of the Syrian refugees in both Turkey and Lebanon will prolong in the shadow of the regime's brutal violations while the international silence continues.
The American Wall Street Journal reported that 2 U.S. officials who asked to remain anonymous said that Washington is secretly working on stopping Iranian oil and weapon shipments to Syria in an effort to accelerate the fall of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The newspaper said that the U.S. efforts aim to get Iraq to close its airspace to flights bound from Iran to Syria, which are suspected of carrying weapons to the regime forces. According to the paper, Washington is also trying to prevent ships suspected of carrying shipments of weapons and oil to Syria through the Suez Canal, noting that one of these ships is called Al Amin and is currently awaiting permission to cross the canal. The newspaper added that the United States transferred secret intelligence information about Syria to the Turkish and Jordanian troops that deal closely with the opposition fighters, pointing out that among the information are images from satellite and military control agencies that reveal details of Syrian military positions and can be used by the opposition. On the sidelines of the Arab Foreign Ministers meeting in Doha, the Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim Al Thani said that the Arab countries all agreed on offering Bashar al-Assad a safe exit in exchange for his stepping down quickly. Sheikh Hamad also called on the opposition to unite and form a provisional government that can be ready to take command of the country after the regime's overthrow. The spokesman of the Syrian regime's foreign ministry, Jihad al-Maqdisi, stressed that the regime rejects the Arabs' invitation, which called al-Assad to step down in return for a safe exit. In a press conference today, Maqdisi admitted that some people in Damascus help the rebels on the ground and provide them with shelter. He added that the regime will react in a military way on the field in Damascus, and he dismissed the fact that the regime would use chemical weapons. Maqdisi admitted that the Syrian Freedom Army is taking control over some border crossings and justified that by saying that these crossings are already out of control and unused since last June. And before we wrap up, here's a reminder of our main stories. Heavy clashes take place in Aleppo, and the regime forces invade several neighborhoods in Damascus, prosecuting civilians. More than 80 killed by the regime forces today, and the bombardment continues on Homs and its suburbs. And Foreign Ministry of the regime refuses the invitation of the Arab Ministerial Committee to find a safe way out for al-Assad in exchange for leaving presidency. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching.